She asked me to cook for her party, but when everyone left, she looked at me and said, "Now only you should feed me." I thought she was joking, until she took the fork from my hand, and everything changed. The message came in just before sunset. Short, polite, and unexpected. She needed a chef for a private dinner. Her usual one had canceled last minute. My client had mentioned me to her, and she was in a bit of a bind. I said yes before I thought twice. I'd met her only once before, from a distance, in a quiet cafe where she'd sat with my client. There was something about her presence that had stayed with me ever since. Calm, deliberate, and quietly magnetic. She wasn't the kind of woman who filled a room with noise. She filled it with gravity. When I arrived at her house, the door opened before I could knock twice. She stood there barefoot, her hair loosely pinned, wearing a soft cream sweater that looked like it belonged to a slower world, one without clocks or deadlines. Her perfume reached me before her words did. A faint mix of citrus and something floral I couldn't name. "You came," she said, smiling in that half-surprised, half-knowing way. I smiled back, trying to look professional while my heartbeat did something completely unprofessional. "You said it was urgent." She led me inside, and I swear, even her house carried her essence. Warm, understated, elegant without trying. The kind of place where silence felt intentional. The kitchen was already half-prepped, and as I unpacked my knives and ingredients, she lingered nearby, wine glass in hand. "You really enjoy this, don't you?" she asked. "Cooking," I said. "It's the only thing that ever listens back." She tilted her head at that, watching as I chopped herbs, the rhythmic sound filling the space between us. "That's a lovely way to put it." Every time she leaned closer to look at something, her shoulder brushed mine. Not enough to call it a touch, but enough to make me aware of how close she was. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. She asked questions: what I was making, how long it would take, why I used butter instead of oil. Simple things, but her voice carried curiosity, not politeness. She wasn't trying to fill the silence. She was studying it. And me. At one point, she reached out to taste the sauce, using the same spoon I had just stirred with. It was such a small act, but when her lips brushed the edge where my hand had been, something inside me shifted. "Perfect," she said softly. I looked up. Her eyes held mine longer than they should have. The air between us wasn't heavy, just alive. It should have felt awkward. Didn't. It felt like the beginning of a conversation we hadn't yet decided to have. I went back to cooking, pretending not to notice the way her gaze followed every movement. The clink of her glass, the simmer of the pan, the soft echo of her breath behind me. They all blended into a rhythm that wasn't just about food anymore. That night, the recipe didn't just belong to the kitchen. It belonged to the silence between us, slow, careful, and already dangerous in its warmth. By the time the guests arrived, the house had transformed. Soft music played in the background. Something jazzy, the kind that drifts through a room without needing attention. Candles flickered along the dining table, reflecting in tall wine glasses. The scent of roasted garlic, herbs, and butter filled the air, warm and welcoming. I stayed in the kitchen, mostly unseen, working through the final touches. But every few minutes, her voice floated back to me. Calm, amused, full of quiet authority. She wasn't loud like the others. She didn't need to be. Her guests were her world. Polished, successful, people who laughed like they'd never had to try too hard at anything. And then there was her, moving through them with effortless grace. I caught glimpses through the open archway, the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her hand rested on the back of a chair, how her laughter came slow, deliberate, never forced. But what caught me off guard was how often her gaze found me. Every few minutes, her eyes would flicker toward the kitchen. Quick, subtle glances, like she was checking that I was still there, like she needed to. At one point, she excused herself and came over, holding an empty glass. "They're enjoying everything," she said softly, leaning closer than she needed to. "Especially the risotto." "That's good," I said, stirring the sauce, trying not to look at her mouth when she smiled. Her perfume mixed with the steam rising from the pan, citrus and wine and something warm. "You don't eat while you cook?" she teased. "Later," I said, "when the night slows down." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, then said, "You might regret waiting." Then she walked back to her guests, leaving that sentence hanging between us like the scent of rosemary and heat. A few minutes later, I heard one of the guests ask, "Who made all this? It's incredible." And her voice, from the dining room, came back clear and smooth. Someone who understands what warmth tastes like. There was laughter, a few murmured compliments, the clink of glasses. But I stood frozen, hand on the ladle, pulse uneven. She wasn't talking about the food. Not really. When she returned again, another excuse, another smile. Her fingers brushed mine as she reached for a plate. It was barely a touch, just the edge of skin against skin, but it felt deliberate, intentional. The kind of contact that says, "I know this isn't supposed to happen, but I don't care." For the rest of the night, I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, cooking, plating, pretending. But every sound, every flicker of light, every distant laugh from the other room, it all felt secondary. Because I knew when the night ended, and the guests were gone, it wouldn't just be the dishes left behind. Something else was waiting in that silence. Something she hadn't said yet, but already promised with her eyes. The last laugh faded with the closing door. Then silence. The kind that doesn't settle right away, but drifts around like smoke. I stood in the kitchen, wiping my hands on a towel, surrounded by empty plates and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The music was still playing somewhere in the background. Low jazz, slow and unhurried. Felt like it didn't belong to the party anymore. It belonged to us. She appeared in the doorway, barefoot again, holding 2 glasses of wine. Her lipstick had faded. Her hair loosened from its pin. She looked softer, real. "You don't have to clean everything now," she said, walking in. "You've already done enough." "I don't mind," I answered, rinsing another plate. "It's easier to stay busy." She set the glasses on the counter. Busy is what people say when they're trying not to feel something. That made me pause. She tilted her head, smiling gently. Not teasing, not accusing, just seeing. "You've been quiet all night. I can tell your mind's somewhere else." I looked up at her. Maybe I'm just trying to be professional. Her eyes held mine for a long second. Maybe that's overrated. There was nothing else to say, not that would sound right. So I just smiled, a little awkwardly, and went back to stacking dishes. She reached out, stopping my hand with a light touch. "Sit with me," she said. "You cooked all this. You should taste it too." It wasn't really a question. I followed her to the dining table. The candles had melted low, their light softer now, golden against the half-empty wine glasses and scattered crumbs. She poured me a drink, then sat across from me. Elbows on the table, chin resting on her hand, watching like she was memorizing something. I tasted the food, and somehow it tasted different, richer, fuller, like it carried the weight of the whole evening. "This," she said, motioning to the plate, "isn't just cooking. It's care. You cook like someone who feels things deeply." I didn't know what to say. Compliments usually slid off me, but her words didn't. They stuck. "You make it sound like that's a bad thing," I said quietly. Her lips curved. "No, it's the rarest thing." The room went still again. Only the soft clink of silverware filled the air. Her gaze didn't move, and I didn't look away. Outside, a breeze pushed against the curtains. The candlelight flickered across her face, and for a brief moment, the world felt smaller, like it existed only inside those 4 walls. I told myself this was nothing, just gratitude, just warmth. But the way her eyes softened when I smiled, that wasn't gratitude. That was something deeper, something beginning. I didn't realize until later that it wasn't the food that brought us to that table. It was everything we weren't saying. And the silence between us tasted exactly like the first hint of something dangerous and beautiful. We stayed at the table longer than we should have. 2 people pretending that conversation was the only reason neither of us stood to leave. The candles had nearly burned out. The wine was gone. The night had stretched into that fragile hour where everything feels a little too honest. She leaned back in her chair, watching me over the rim of her glass. "You know," she said softly, "you've been avoiding my eyes all night." I gave a half smile. "Because every time I look, you stare back." She laughed. Low, quiet, like the sound was meant to stay between us. "Is that a problem?" "It should be," I said. "But it's not." Her gaze flickered to my hands, resting on the table, fingers tracing circles against the wood without realizing. "You cook with your hands like they're a language," she murmured. "Do you ever wonder if people notice?" "Not really." "I do." That stopped me. Her voice had softened, but there was something raw in it, something that made my pulse stumble. The air between us felt charged, the kind of tension that doesn't demand movement but dares you to stay still. Then, without warning, she reached across the table and slid a plate toward me. "You never actually ate properly," she said. "Let me fix that." She took a small piece of food with her fork, brought it toward me, then paused halfway. Her expression was playful, but her eyes weren't. I froze. "Open," she said softly, almost teasing, but not quite. I hesitated, but she didn't move. The world had narrowed down to that fork, her hand, and the pulse in my throat. So I leaned forward. The fork brushed my lip, a tiny electric contact, before she pulled it back, smiling faintly. "See," she whispered. "You were starving and didn't even know it." The words hit deeper than they should have. I wasn't sure if she was talking about the food anymore. For a moment we just sat there, silent. The clock ticked. The music hummed. Her eyes stayed on mine, unflinching, curious, daring. Then she exhaled, almost laughing at herself. "You're terrible at pretending this is just dinner." "I could say the same about you," I said quietly. That made her look away. The first time all night she seemed unsure. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, then stilled. "Maybe I forgot how to pretend," she murmured. Something in her voice made my chest ache. Not desire, not yet, but something closer to recognition. Two people who weren't supposed to find comfort here, but did anyway. Neither of us moved for a long time. The distance across the table felt thinner than breath. And when she finally looked back at me, it wasn't a look of curiosity anymore. It was something that said, "You feel this too, don't you?" I did. And that was the first moment I stopped being her chef and started becoming something else entirely. The kitchen felt different after that moment. Quieter, softer, like even the air had started listening. The guests' laughter and noise were long gone, replaced by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the clink of dishes as I tried to clean up, to distract myself. She joined me without a word, slipping beside me at the sink. Her sweater sleeve brushed my arm as she reached for a plate. "You don't have to do this," I said, trying to sound casual. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." Her tone was simple, but it carried something else. A warmth that wasn't gratitude. We worked side by side, passing dishes, rinsing, drying. Every time our hands met, even briefly, it felt like the world stopped for a heartbeat. The space between us kept shrinking, not physically, but in the kind of way that makes you forget boundaries even exist. She broke the silence first. "You're very careful when you cook," she said softly. "Every movement, every detail. But when you talk, you hold back." I smiled a little. "That's because words don't always come out the way I mean them. Maybe you just need someone to listen better," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful. I glanced at her, and she met my eyes. There was no teasing this time, just quiet understanding. The kind that feels like standing under warm light after being in the dark too long. She turned back to the dishes, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Then she said, "You made me feel seen tonight." The words landed so softly, I almost thought I'd misheard. I set down the dish I was holding. "What do you mean?" She didn't look up. "You didn't just cook for me. You paid attention. You noticed what I liked, what I didn't. The little things no one else does anymore." She gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "Do you know how rare that is?" I swallowed, unsure what to do with the sudden ache in my chest. Maybe people just forget to look closely. And you don't? She asked. I can't help it, I said. I think that's how I understand people, through what they need, even when they don't say it. For a long moment, the only sound was water running over porcelain. Then she reached for a towel, drying her hands slowly, before turning toward me. Then tell me, she whispered. What do I need? I met her gaze, calm, steady, searching. I didn't have the right words, so I did the only thing that felt honest. I reached out and gently took her wrist, my thumb brushing over the faint pulse beneath her skin. You need someone who doesn't just see you, I said quietly. Someone who stays. Her breath caught, just barely. The towel slipped from her hand, landing soundlessly between us. She didn't move, neither did I. And in that stillness, the faint smell of soap, the soft warmth of her wrist, the dim kitchen light, everything unspoken between us finally felt real. The silence that followed lingered like the last note of a song. Neither of us knew what to do with it, or maybe we did, but were both afraid of what would come next. I finally let go of her wrist, gently, like setting something fragile down. She didn't step back right away. Her eyes lingered on me, calm but unreadable, the kind of look that holds both gratitude and danger. Then she smiled faintly, a small, knowing curve of her lips. You're too young to talk like that, she said softly. Maybe, I answered, but that doesn't make it less true. She tilted her head as if studying me again. Not the way she had earlier when she was curious, but now with something deeper. Respect. Maybe even hesitation. Do you always mean what you say? She asked. Only when I shouldn't, I replied before thinking. That made her laugh. The quiet, breathy kind that ends with a sigh. She turned, walking toward the counter where the wine bottle sat half empty, and poured herself a little more. You make it very hard to stay in control of an evening. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice to sound steady. She took a sip, then looked at me over the rim of the glass. You should probably leave before I say something I can't take back. But neither of us moved. The night outside had gone completely still. The house, the city, the world. Everything seemed to pause, waiting for whichever one of us would decide what happened next. I gathered my things, my knives, my apron, the towel I'd used to dry her dishes, trying to convince myself that this was just another job ending. That what I felt wasn't real, just the residue of a long night. When I finally turned toward the door, she followed me, barefoot again, the wooden floor soft beneath each step. At the doorway, she stopped. Her voice came quiet, almost shy for the first time. I haven't had someone in my home like this in years. I looked back at her. Like this. She smiled faintly. Someone who makes it feel alive. I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was nod, feeling my throat tighten. I reached for the handle, and that's when she said it. Now, she whispered. Only you should feed me. The words didn't sound like a request. They sounded like a promise she wasn't supposed to make. I turned back, heart beating hard enough that I couldn't hide it. That's a dangerous thing to say, I murmured. Then maybe I'm done being careful. We stood there, caught in a moment that felt both infinite and impossible. I wanted to close the distance, to tell her what her words had done to me. But instead, I stepped outside, the cool night air crashing over me like a wave. She stayed in the doorway, her figure outlined by warm light. Neither of us said goodbye. And as I walked away, her voice, that single sentence, echoed louder than anything else that night. Sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, her voice replayed, soft, certain, and far too intimate to forget. Now only you should feed me. The words had sunk deeper than I expected, winding through every thought until morning light began to slip through my curtains. I got up before the sun fully rose. I didn't plan it. There was no logic, no reason, just a quiet pull that felt stronger than hesitation. I found myself in the kitchen again, making breakfast. Something simple. Toasted brioche, scrambled eggs with herbs, fresh coffee. Warm, honest food. Food that said more than words could. By the time I packed everything into a basket, the city was just waking up. The sky glowed pale gold. I told myself I was just returning a dish she'd lent me, just being polite. But deep down, I knew better. When she opened the door, she looked startled. Not in a bad way, but like she hadn't expected the morning to answer her so soon. Her robe was tied loosely at the waist, hair a little messy, her voice still thick with sleep. "You're here," she said quietly. "You said you only wanted to be fed by me," I said, half smiling, holding up the basket. "I take things literally." That made her laugh. A small, genuine sound that broke through the quiet like sunlight through blinds. She stepped aside, motioning me in. "You really shouldn't be this reckless with promises." "I think you started it," I said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. We moved to the kitchen, and I began unpacking everything, trying to focus on the food instead of how the morning light caught in her hair. She sat at the counter, chin resting on her hand, watching me again. The same way she had the night before, but now softer, more open. "You didn't sleep," she said, studying me. "Did you?" No, that one word carried the same truth as mine. When the food was ready, I placed a plate in front of her. She looked down at it, then up at me, smiling faintly. "You really came back. You really wanted me to." Her fingers brushed mine as she reached for the fork. A quiet, lingering touch. This time, neither of us looked away. We ate slowly, the air between us calm and warm. The house smelled of coffee and toast, of something safe and new. She told me stories about her life, the kind that sound light but carry weight underneath. I listened, not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember every word. At one point, she paused and looked at me, really looked. "You make things feel easy," she whispered. "Even the hard parts." And I realized then that what had begun as a job had quietly turned into something neither of us could name, but both of us understood. When I left later that morning, she followed me to the door again, not to say goodbye this time, but to stand close enough for silence to mean everything. I didn't know what we were becoming. All I knew was that I'd come to feed her once, and somehow she'd fed something in me too.